wind did not blow in the Arizona Territory so much as it scoured. It carried the grit of 1,000 dry miles, picking up sand from the Sonora and flinging it against the rough-hewn pine of the ranch house until the wood was polished gray. It was a land that demanded silence, and Daniel Hayes gave it exactly that. He rode his bay mare, heavy with the heat of the afternoon. Along the northern stretch of his barbed wire fence, the sun was a white blister in a sky so pale it looked drained of blood. It was late in the year 1879, or maybe early 1880. Daniel had stopped counting the years with any real care after the fire. Now, time was measured only in seasons of drought, seasons of calving, and seasons of killing. Daniel was a man built for this hardness, mid-30s, though his face looked older, carved from granite and leather. His shoulders were broad, straining the seams of a faded blue shirt that had seen too many washings in alkali water. He pulled his hat low, squinting against the glare, his eyes the color of flint, scanning the horizon not for beauty, but for threats. His knuckles, resting on the saddle horn, were scarred and thick, the hands of a man who had built fences, branded hides, and dug graves. He pulled the mare up as he reached a section of cedar posts that leaned drunkenly toward the canyon. Recent brush fires had licked at the edges of his property, leaving great black scars across the golden scrub grass. The smell of char still lingered, faint but sharp, mixing with a scent of sage and horse sweat. Daniel dismounted, his boots crunching in the dry earth. He checked the wire. It was taut, singing a low, mournful note in the wind. He took a glove off, wiping sweat from his forehead, and reached into his breast pocket. His fingers brushed the edge of a photograph, folded and worn soft as cloth. He did not pull it out. He knew the image by heart, a woman with laughing eyes and a small boy sitting on her lap, holding a wooden horse. Anna and Tommy. A sudden crack echoed from the distant hills. Thunder, or rockfall. Daniel flinched. His hand flew to the stock of the repeater rifle scabbarded on his saddle. It was an old cavalry issue, heavy and reliable. His heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs, the sound of drums pounding in his ears. Ghost drums. He breathed out slowly, forcing his hand away from the gun. There was nothing there, just the wind, just the empty, hateful silence. The territory was on edge. He could feel it when he rode into town for supplies. The talk in the saloon was no longer about rain or beef prices, but about the Apache. There were rumors of Victorio or Geronimo moving bands through the Dragoon Mountains, of raids on isolated homesteads. And there was the other talk, the darker talk of the cattlemen who wanted the range clear. "Drive them out," Roy Dugan had said, slamming a fist onto the bar counter 3 days ago. "Every last one, man, woman, and child. The army is too soft. We need to clear the brush ourselves." Daniel had said nothing then, just paid for his flour and coffee and left. He had been a scout once, years ago. He had ridden with the soldiers, guided them to the hidden springs and the rancherias. He knew what clearing the brush meant. It meant blood on the rocks and smoke rising in columns that could be seen for 20 miles. He had quit that life, but the guilt stuck to him like a second skin. He mounted the mare again and continued riding. 2 miles west. The wire was not leaning. It was cut. Daniel stared down at the severed strands, the ends bright and sharp where the cutters had bitten through. Hoof prints churned the dust on the other side, unshod ponies, and the deeper, cloven tracks of cattle. His cattle. He did not curse. He did not have the energy for anger, only a cold, heavy resignation. He spurred the mare through the gap, his eyes locked on the ground. The trail was easy to read, even in the hard-packed wash. 5, maybe 6 riders, driving 10 head of steers. They were moving fast, pushing the animals hard toward the broken country of the Dragon's Tooth Hills. He tracked them for 3 hours. The sun began its slow descent, turning the light brassy and harsh. The land grew wilder, the juniper trees sparse and twisted, clinging to rock ledges. He saw a small campsite in a dry creek bed, abandoned in haste. A circle of stones, a few scattered bones of a rabbit, a piece of torn rawhide, They had not stayed long. They were running. Daniel checked the load in his rifle. He loosened the Colt revolver in the holster at his hip. He was one man against 6, but he knew the land, and he knew how they rode. He would not engage them if he could help it. He would wait for night, spook the herd, and try to turn the cattle back. It was a fool's errand, risking his life for 10 steers. But the cattle were all he had. They were the reason he woke up in the morning. Without the ranch, he was just a man with a pocket full of ghosts. As he crested a ridge, he saw the vultures. They were a slow, black spiral in the sky, lazily circling a narrow ravine a mile ahead. Daniel felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Vultures did not circle stolen cattle unless the cattle were dead. And if the cattle were dead, the thieves had been stopped. He approached the ravine slowly, keeping to the skyline, using the rocks for cover. The wind shifted, blowing up from the canyon floor. It brought a smell that made the mare toss her head and snort in fear. It was the smell of a butcher shop in August, the smell of copper and rot. Daniel tied the horse to a scrub oak and advanced on foot, his rifle cradled in his arms. He moved silently, his boots finding the quiet places between the gravel. He peered over the rim of the ravine. It was not a campsite anymore. It was a slaughterhouse. The Apache raiders had been caught in a box canyon, likely stopping to rest the animals. The attack had come from the high ground. Where Daniel stood now, he could see the brass shell casings scattered in the dirt near his feet. 45-70 government loads, soldiers. Below, the carnage was absolute. The 10 steers lay bloated and shot, killed to deny them to the enemy. But the men were there too, and not just men. Daniel slid down the scree slope, his boots sliding in the loose rock. The silence here was heavy, buzzing with the sound of 1,000 flies. He walked among the bodies. There were 7 Apaches, 4 warriors, stripped of their weapons and most of their clothing. 2 women, 1 child, a boy no older than 6. He stopped by the boy. The small body was twisted, lying half under a dead horse. Daniel looked away, a wave of nausea rolling over him. He remembered the fire. He remembered Tommy's small wooden horse found in the ashes. They did not have to kill the boy, he thought, the old hatred for the uniform rising in his throat. They did not have to kill the cattle. He walked through the camp, checking for life. Though he expected none, the soldiers had been thorough. They had ridden down, put bullets in the wounded, and ridden out. The boot prints in the bloody mud were unmistakably army issue, iron-heeled, square-toed. He was about to turn back, to leave this place to the birds and the coyotes, when he heard it. A scrape of rock against rock, a ragged intake of breath. Daniel spun, the rifle stock hitting his shoulder in a fluid motion. He aimed at a pile of brush and fallen rocks near the canyon wall. "Come out," he said, his voice raspy from hours of silence. There was movement in the shadows. A hand, brown and smeared with dried blood, clawed at the dirt. Then a figure dragged itself into the light. It was a woman. She was young, perhaps 20. Her dark hair was loose and matted with gore, hanging over her face like a curtain. Her buckskin dress was torn at the shoulder and soaked dark at the thigh. She dragged her left leg as she crawled, her face a mask of gray dust and agony. She saw him, a tall white man with a gun, and her eyes went wide, filled with a terror so pure it looked like madness. She scrambled backward, her back hitting the rock wall. Her hand fumbled at her belt and came up with a knife. It was a skinning knife, the blade short and curved. She held it out, the point wavering. Her hand trembled violently. She tried to rise, to lunge at him, but her leg gave way and she collapsed, crying out in a language that sounded like stones breaking. Daniel kept the rifle leveled at her chest. He had seen wounded Apaches feign weakness to get close enough to strike. He had seen men die with knives in their bellies because they hesitated. "Drop it," he ordered. She looked at the gun, then at his face. She saw the scar on his chin, the cold blue of his eyes. She looked at the dead boy 10 yards away. The fight drained out of her. The knife slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the stones. She pressed her forehead into the dirt, her shoulders shaking. Then she spoke, her voice a cracked whisper. The words were English, broken and twisted, but clear enough. "Do not shoot!" Daniel did not lower the rifle. "You were with the raiders," he said. She raised her head. Tears cut tracks through the dust on her cheeks. "No kill," she pleaded. "I serve. I work." She gestured frantically to herself, to her hands, then to the ground at his feet. "You want. I do. Slave. Woman. Anything. You say I do. Just no kill." The raw desperation in her voice hit Daniel like a physical blow. She was bargaining with the only currency she had left. Her life, her body, her freedom. She expected him to kill her. Or worse, she was offering herself as a slave to prevent a bullet. Daniel looked at her. Really looked at her. He saw the high cheekbones, the dark eyes swimming with fear, the way her hands curled into fists in the dirt, and suddenly, he did not see an Apache. He did not see the enemy who had terrorized the territory. He saw a human being terrified of fire. The memory washed over him, unbidden and agonizing. The night the ranch house burned, Anna screaming his name from the upper window. The heat so intense it singed his eyebrows as he tried to break the door down. The way the roof collapsed in a shower of sparks, silencing the screams. He had failed to save them. He had stood there, gun in hand, useless against the flames. He looked at the woman's bleeding leg. The soldiers had left her for dead. If he left her now, she would die of thirst or the coyotes would get her by nightfall. If he shot her, it would be a mercy compared to that. But the voice in his head, the one that sounded like the scout he used to be, whispered, "She is the enemy. Her people killed your neighbors. They stole your cattle. Walk away. Daniel, walk away." He stood there for a long time in the heat, the rifle heavy in his arms. The vultures circled lower, their shadows flitting across the woman's back. She did not move. She waited for the sound of the hammer cocking. Daniel let out a long, shuddering breath. He slowly lowered the barrel of the rifle until it pointed at the ground. "Damn it all to hell," he whispered. He safetied the weapon and shoved it into the crook of his arm. "Can you stand?" he asked. She stared at him, uncomprehending. He stepped forward. She flinched, curling into a ball. "Easy," he said, his voice gruff. "I am not going to hurt you." He knelt beside her. The smell of blood was overpowering. He reached for her injured leg. She hissed in pain and tried to pull away, but he held her firm. The bullet had passed through the fleshy part of the thigh. It had missed the bone, but the wound was ragged and dirty. Daniel pulled a bandana from his pocket. It was not clean, but it was better than nothing. He tied it tight around the wound to staunch the bleeding. She bit her lip until it bled, but she did not cry out. "We have to ride," he said. "Cannot stay here." He stood and offered her a hand. She looked at it as if it were a trap. Slowly, she reached out. Her fingers were small and rough, calloused from work. He pulled her up. She put her weight on the bad leg and buckled. Daniel caught her. He swung her up into his arms. She was light, too light. Starvation rations. She went rigid against his chest, her heart beating like a trapped bird against his ribs. He carried her out of the ravine, up the slope to where the mare waited. He lifted her into the saddle. She gripped the pommel, her knuckles white. Daniel mounted behind her, settling into the cantle. He had to reach around her to take the reins. The proximity was sudden and jarring. He could smell the smoke in her hair, the sweat, the fear. Her back was pressed against his chest. "Hold on," he muttered. He turned the mare's head north, away from the slaughter, back toward the ranch. The ride was an agony of silence. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of bruised purple and blood red. The temperature dropped plummeting as it did in the high desert. The air grew sharp and cold. Daniel felt the woman shivering. He shifted his weight, unbuckling his canvas duster coat, and draped it awkwardly around her shoulders. She stiffened at his touch but pulled the fabric tight around herself. "My name is Daniel," he said to the back of her head. She did not answer for a mile. Then, a whisper carried away by the wind. "Tala, Tala," he repeated. It sounded like the land itself, soft but hard underneath. They rode through the twilight, two ghosts moving through a graveyard of juniper and stone. Daniel kept his eyes on the horizon, but his mind was racing. What was he doing, bringing an Apache woman to his house? The town would hang him if they knew. The soldiers would arrest him. And what would he do with her? Keep her? Release her? She had offered to serve him. The words echoed in his mind. I serve. I work. Anything. He felt a flush of shame heat his neck. He was a man who had been alone for 3 years. The loneliness was a physical ache, a hollow space in his chest, but he was not a monster. He would not take advantage of a terrified woman's bargain. He was saving a life. That was all. Wasn't it? The moon rose, a sliver of bone in the black sky. The coyotes began to sing, their yips and howls echoing off the canyon walls. Tala tensed at the sound. She was listening for other sounds, hoofbeats, voices. She was a woman who had been hunted her entire life. They crested the final rise, and the ranch lay below them in the shallow valley. It was a dark shape against the darkness. The windmill creaked, a lonely, metal sound. The house was dark. He had left no lantern burning. It looked small, fragile, a wooden box sitting on the edge of a vast, indifferent nothingness. Daniel guided the horse down the slope. The hooves clattered on the hard-packed yard. He pulled up by the porch. The dogs, 2 scruffy hounds, came out from under the steps, growling low until they recognized his scent, then whining uncertainly at the stranger. Daniel dismounted, his legs stiff. He reached up for Tala. She looked at the house, then at the vast, empty desert stretching out behind them. She looked at Daniel. In her eyes, he saw the calculation. This place was isolated. There was nowhere to run. She was wounded. She was alone with a white man who had a gun and a great deal of anger. She slid down into his arms, and he set her gently on the dirt. She leaned against the hitching rail to keep from falling. This is it, Daniel said, gesturing to the dark house. Home. Tala looked at the wooden structure. It had walls to keep the wind out. It had a door that could be barred. But as she looked at Daniel, standing tall and shadowy in the moonlight, she knew the walls would keep her in just as surely as they kept the world out. She nodded once, a sharp, jerky motion. She was alive. For tonight, that had to be enough. Daniel walked up the steps and pushed the door open. The darkness inside seemed to swallow the moonlight. He struck a match, the sudden flare illuminating his weary, etched face. He lit the lantern hanging by the door. Come inside, he said. Tala limped up the stairs. She paused at the threshold, looking back one last time at the hills. Then she stepped into the house, and the door closed behind her, shutting out the wind and the coyotes, leaving them alone in the silence. The light that woke her was not the soft, gray dawn of the mountains she knew, but a harsh, white bar that cut across the floorboards like a blade. Tala lay still for a long time, listening. The air smelled of stale pine and dried dust. She was on a mattress, a thing of ticking and straw, covered by a rough wool blanket that smelled of a man. She sat up slowly. Her left leg throbbed with a dull, heavy rhythm, wrapped tightly in clean linen. The room was small, spare, and cold despite the sunlight. A single chair, a wash basin on a crate, and bare walls that had never known paint. It was a cell. She swung her good leg to the floor, testing her weight. The pain in her thigh was sharp, but the bone held. She stood, gripping the wall for support, and limped toward the door. Her heart hammered against her ribs. If it was locked, she was a prisoner. If it was open, she was something else, though she did not know what. Her fingers closed around the cold iron latch. It lifted. The door swung inward with a groan of dry hinges. She stepped out onto a porch that ran the length of the house. The wind hit her instantly, hot and full of grit. Sitting on the steps, 10 feet away, was the white man, Daniel. He was cleaning his rifle, a rag moving rhythmically over the dark steel barrel. He did not look up when the door creaked, but his hands stopped moving for a fraction of a second before resuming their work. It was an answer, without words. "You are not locked in," the rifle said. but you are not free to leave." Daniel set the gun down across his knees and turned to look at her. His face was shadowed by the brim of his hat, but his eyes were clear and hard. He looked tired, the lines around his mouth deep with exhaustion. "You slept a long time," he said. His voice was gravel, low and unpolished. Tala leaned against the doorframe, taking the weight off her leg. She said nothing. She waited for him to tell her what she was. Daniel cleared his throat, looking out toward the windmill that spun lazily in the distance. He seemed to find it difficult to look at her directly. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the arrangement." He stood up, towering over the steps. He was a big man, broad in the shoulders, with hands that looked like they could crush stone. Tala felt a flicker of the terror she had felt in the ravine, the memory of her own voice begging, offering her body to save her life. She saw the flush of color rise in his neck, a red stain of shame. He remembered it too. He was ashamed that he had hesitated, ashamed that for a moment, amidst the blood and death, he had considered her offer. "You can stay," Daniel said. His words clipped, "but this is a working ranch. I do not carry dead weight. Once that leg heals, you work, you cook, you keep the house. You help with the stock where you can." He finally looked at her, his gaze sliding away from her eyes to a point over her shoulder. "You work, you eat, you have a roof. That is the deal." Tala nodded once. "I work," she said. The words felt strange in her mouth, thick and foreign. "Good," Daniel said. He picked up his rifle and walked toward the barn, his boots thudding heavy on the dirt. "There is beans on the stove. Eat." The first week was a blur of pain and silence. Tala learned the geography of her prison. The house was 4 rooms of rough-cut lumber, built to withstand the wind, but not to comfort the soul. The kitchen was dominated by a black iron stove that radiated heat even when the fire was low. The floors were swept clean, but always gritty, with the sand that blew in through the cracks in the walls. She moved through the house like a ghost, favoring her injured leg. Every time Daniel entered a room, she made herself small, pressing into corners or busying herself with a rag. She watched him with the eyes of a trapped animal. She watched where he hung the rifle. She watched where he kept the skinning knife by the back door. She found a metal spoon in the drawer and spent hours when he was away grinding the handle against a flat stone behind the house until it was a jagged, sharp point. She kept it hidden in the folds of her skirt, tied to her waist with a strip of rawhide. If he tried to touch her, if the shame she saw in his face turned to the hunger she had seen in the eyes of other soldiers, she would not beg again. The land itself was a brutal master. The well was deep and stubborn. Drawing water meant turning a rusted iron crank that screamed in protest, hauling up a heavy oak bucket from the dark earth. The water was cold and tasted of minerals, but it was life. The sun beat down with a physical weight, bleaching the color out of the world until everything was pale brown and gray. Daniel was gone before sunrise, riding the fence line or checking the herd. He returned at dusk, gray with dust, his shirt stained with sweat. They ate in silence at the small pine table. The only sounds were the scrape of forks on tin plates and the relentless wind rattling the window panes. "More coffee?" he would ask. "No," she would answer. That was the extent of their speech. But as the days turned into weeks, the silence began to shift. It was no longer the silence of the hunter and the prey, but the silence of 2 people enduring the same hardship. One morning, Tala came into the kitchen to find a cup of coffee waiting on the table. It was still hot. Beside it lay her second dress, the one she had been wearing in the ravine. It had been torn at the hem. Now, it was mended. The stitches were large and clumsy, black thread pulling the brown fabric together in a pucker. But it was whole. She ran her thumb over the rough stitching. He had done this by lamplight, with his large, scarred hands, while she slept. 2 days later, she was carrying a bucket of slop to the hogs he kept in a pen behind the barn. Her leg caught on a root, and pain shot up her hip, white and hot. She gasped and stumbled, the bucket slipping from her grip. Before it hit the ground, a hand caught the bale. Daniel was there. He did not speak. He did not scold her for her clumsiness. He simply took the heavy bucket from her hand, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting second. His skin was rough, calloused, and hot. He walked to the pen and poured the slop, then returned the empty bucket to her. "Careful with the leg," he said, and turned back to his work. Tala watched him go. She touched the spot on her hand where he had brushed her. He was a hard man, a man of violence. She had seen the soldier boots, the rifle, but there was a quietness in him that confused her. He did not shout. He did not drink, until he was mean. He treated the horses with a firm, gentle hand. She began to look for ways to pay the debt that was not a debt. She found a set of old harness in the barn, the leather dried and cracking, a strap broken. She took it to the porch and worked the leather with grease she rendered from bacon fat. She used an awl and sinew she found in his supplies to stitch the break, her fingers moving with a skill born of necessity. When Daniel found it hanging on the peg, repaired and supple, he stopped and looked at it for a long time. He nodded to her, a single, sharp dip of his chin. It was more praise than if he had spoken 100 words. Daniel suffered from a pain in his shoulder. She saw him rubbing it in the evenings, grimacing when he lifted the coffee pot. It was an old injury, a deep ache that came with the cold nights. Tala went to the creek bed, where the sparse willows grew. She found the creosote bush and the sage. She boiled the leaves into a dark, pungent poultice. That night, she set the bowl on the table. "For pain," she said, gesturing to his shoulder. Daniel looked at the green sludge, then at her. "Apache medicine?" "Good medicine," she said. He hesitated, then unbuttoned his shirt, exposing the shoulder. The skin was pale below the tan line, and a jagged white scar ran across the muscle. Tala applied the poultice, her fingers working the heat into the flesh. He tensed at her touch, his breath catching, but he did not pull away. When she was done, he moved the arm. The stiffness was gone. "Thank you," he said softly. The fragile truce held until the day the bay gelding panicked. It was a young horse, skittish and half wild. Daniel was trying to shoe it in the corral. The horse reared, eyes rolling white, striking out with iron-shod hooves. Daniel shouted, waving his hat, but the animal only grew more frantic, backing into the rails, threatening to break a leg. Tala was watching from the porch. She saw Daniel grab for a rope, his frustration mounting. She dropped the broom she was holding and limped to the corral. "No," she called out. "No shout." Daniel turned, sweat dripping from his nose. "Get back, Tala! He is crazy!" Tala slipped between the rails. She did not look at Daniel. She looked at the horse. She made a low sound in her throat, a humming vibration that was more breath than noise. She walked forward slowly, her eyes lowered, her body relaxed. The horse snorted, ears pinned back, trembling. Tala did not stop. She reached out a hand, palm up. She continued the sound. The horse flicked an ear. She moved closer until she could smell the animal's fear. She touched the velvet nose, then moved her hand up to the forelock, scratching firmly behind the ears. The horse let out a long, shuddering sigh and dropped its head. Daniel stood by the fence, the rope dangling from his hand, watching in disbelief. The woman who had been a trembling heap in the ravine now stood commanding 1,000 pounds of terrified muscle with nothing but a touch. "He is afraid of the hammer," Tala said, stroking the horse's neck. "Show him the hammer. Slow." Daniel picked up the hammer slowly. The horse flinched, but Tala murmured to it, holding it steady. They shod the horse together in the dust and heat. And when they were done, Daniel looked at her with a new expression. It was respect. "You have a way with them," he said. "Horses have honest hearts." She said, "Men are harder." A week later, the supplies ran low. The flour barrel was empty, and the coffee was gone. Daniel announced he was going to town. "Get in the wagon," he said. Tala froze. "Town? I need help loading," he said. "And you need boots. That leg is healing, but you cannot walk the ranch in those moccasins." "People see," she whispered. "They will see a Mexican girl," Daniel said. his jaw set. "Cover your hair. Keep your head down." "Do not speak English." He tossed her a dark shawl. Tala wrapped it around her head, shadowing her face. She climbed onto the wagon seat, feeling the sharpened spoon pressing against her hip. The town was a collection of false-fronted buildings clinging to a single muddy street. It was noisy. Dogs barked, wagons clattered, and men shouted from the boardwalks. To Tala, after the silence of the ranch, it was a chaotic assault. She shrank into the shawl, making herself invisible. Daniel parked the wagon in front of the general store. "Stay close," he ordered. They walked inside. The store smelled of pickle brine, tobacco, and dry goods. Two men were leaning against the counter, talking to the proprietor. One of them was a thick-set man with a face like a slab of beef. Roy Dugan. The conversation stopped when Daniel entered. The silence that followed was heavy and sharp. "Daniel," Dugan said, nodding slowly. His eyes flicked to Tala, lingering on her dark skin. The shawl, the way she stood half behind Daniel. "Who is the girl?" "Hired help," Daniel said, his voice flat. From down south, Dugan spat a stream of tobacco juice into a brass spittoon. "Mexican, huh? Looks a little dark for a Mexican." "She is Yaqui," Daniel lied smoothly. "Does not speak a word of English. I need 50 pounds of flour, Sam, and coffee." He moved to the counter, placing himself between Tala and the men. Tala kept her eyes on the floorboards, counting the knots in the wood. She could feel Dugan's eyes on her, a physical weight crawling over her skin. She knew that look. It was the look a wolf gives a weak calf. "You hear about the raids?" Dugan asked, his voice booming in the small space. "More cattle taken over near the basin. Apaches." "I heard," Daniel said, counting out coins. "We are getting up a meeting next week." Dugan continued, stepping closer. "The army is useless. They chase ghosts. We are talking about handling it ourselves. A sweep. Clean out the canyons. Wipe them out. Daniel, every last savage." Tala flinched. The words were blows. Wipe them out. It was not a figure of speech. She had seen what it meant. She saw the ravine again. The dead boy under the horse. She gripped her hands together under her shawl until her nails cut into her palms. Her face remained a mask of stone. "I have got fences to mend." "Roy," Daniel said, "do not have time for passes." "You might want to make time," Dugan said, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. "You live out there on the edge. You are exposed, unless you have got some reason to think they won't hit you." It was an accusation. Daniel turned slowly, his hand resting near his hip. "I take care of my own. Roy. Always have." "Sure," Dugan said, smiling without humor. "Just be careful who you call your own. Hayes, some things do not mix." Daniel took the sack of flour. "Come on," he said to Tala. They walked out into the sunlight. Tala felt the eyes of the town on her back. 100 unseen enemies. She climbed into the wagon, her hands shaking. Daniel whipped the horses into a trot, driving out of town faster than usual. He did not speak for 5 miles. His knuckles were white on the reins. That night, the ranch was quiet, but the air inside the house felt charged with the electricity of the day's violence. Tala lay in her bed, staring at the dark ceiling. She could not sleep. The image of Dugan's face burned in her mind. Then she heard it, a shout from Daniel's room. "No, get back, Anna!" It was a strangled cry, full of panic. Then came the sound of thrashing, the bed slats creaking violently. "Tommy, run! The door!" Tala rose and walked silently to his door. It was open. In the moonlight, she saw Daniel tangling in his sheets, fighting an invisible enemy. He was sweating, his face twisted in agony. I cannot reach them," he sobbed, the sound breaking into a low moan. Tala stood in the doorway, her hand on the frame. She should leave. He was the white man, the enemy, the jailer. But seeing him like this, stripped of his rifle and his stoicism, he was just a man haunted by fire. She felt a strange twisting in her chest. It was fear, yes, but also a deep, aching pity. And beneath that, something softer, a recognition of a shared wound. She watched him until his breathing slowed and he fell back into a restless sleep. She did not go to him, but she did not leave the doorway for a long time. 2 days later, the sky turned a bruised yellow. The wind picked up, screaming around the eaves of the house, a dust storm. By noon, the world outside was a swirling wall of brown grit. The sun was blotted out. Sand hissed against the windows like dry rain. They were trapped inside. Daniel lit the kerosene lamp on the kitchen table, though it was only 2 in the afternoon. The golden light carved a small circle of warmth against the howling dark outside. Daniel poured 2 cups of coffee. He pushed one toward her. He sat heavily, listening to the wind. "It will blow all night," he said. Tala wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic cup. "The wind is angry," she said. Daniel looked at her. The storm seemed to have loosened something in him. Or perhaps it was the memory of the town, or the nightmares. "My wife," he said suddenly. He did not look at her. He looked at the flame of the lamp. Her name was Anna. The boy was Tommy. He was 4. Tala went still. He had never spoken their names to her. "It was a range war," Daniel continued, his voice monotone. "Not Indians, white men, fighting over water rights. They set fire to the house while I was out in the barn. I tried to get to them." He looked at his hands, turning them over. The roof came down. I stood there and watched it burn. I was a scout for the army then. I could track a lizard across rock. I could shoot a man at 500 yards, but I could not open a door. He looked up at her, and his eyes were open wounds. "I hunted your people, Tala. After the fire, I hated everything. I guided the soldiers. I showed them where the winter camps were. I told myself it was justice, but it was just killing." The confession hung in the air, heavy as the dust. He was admitting to being the monster she had feared, but he was also admitting he was broken by it. Tala looked down at the coffee, the dark liquid trembling slightly from the vibration of the wind. "My father," she said softly. "He was a singer. He sang the morning songs." Daniel watched her, waiting. The soldiers came at dawn. She said, "Blue coats. They did not ask who was fighting. They just shot. My mother ran with the baby. They shot her in the back. I saw it. I ran into the rocks. I hid." She looked up, meeting his gaze. "I wandered for 3 years. Small bands. Always hungry. Always running. Eat lizards. Eat roots. Then the ambush in the ravine. You found me. I found you," Daniel repeated. "I thought you were death," she said. "I almost was," he whispered. The distance between the 2 chairs seemed to shrink. The table was narrow. Her hand rested on the wood, inches from his. He could see the pulse beating in her wrist. She could see the gray flecks in his blue eyes. The hatred that the world demanded they feel for each other was there, outside in the wind, in the town with Roy Dugan, in the history of blood and fire, but in this room, in the lamp's glow, there was only 2 people who had lost everything. Daniel looked at her hand. It was small, capable, scarred by the life she had led. He felt a sudden, terrifying urge to cover it with his own, to feel the warmth of a living person who understood the language of ghosts. The silence stretched, thick with an unspoken desire that was born of grief and loneliness. Tala did not pull her hand away. She watched him, her lips slightly parted, her breath shallow. The air in the room grew heavy. The scent of coffee and kerosene mixed with the smell of the dust and the faint, sweet scent of the sage she used on her hair. Daniel's hand twitched. He started to reach out. Then the wind slammed a loose shutter against the wall with a crack like a gunshot. Daniel flinched violently. The spell shattered. He scraped his chair back, standing up abruptly. His face was closed again, the mask of the rancher sliding back into place. He was afraid, not of her, but of what was happening, of the softness growing in the hard ground of his heart. "Go to bed, Tala," he said, his voice rough. "The storm will pass." He turned his back on her and walked to the window, staring out into the blinding dust, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Tala looked at his broad back for a moment. She wanted to reach out, to touch the tension in his shoulders, but she knew the line had been drawn. She stood up, favoring her leg, which was aching in the low pressure. "Good night, Daniel," she said. She walked to her room and closed the door, but she did not lock it, and as she lay in the dark, listening to the wind scour the house, she knew that the man in the other room was no longer her jailer. He was something much more dangerous. He was a man she could love. The dust storm that had trapped them inside the house was only the herald of a deeper, crueler season. Summer descended on the territory like a heavy iron skillet lid, trapping the heat and baking the moisture out of the earth until the ground cracked open in jagged fissures. The silence of the high desert changed. It was no longer the silence of emptiness, but the silence of waiting for rain that did not come. The cattle grew thin, their ribs showing like washboards through dull hides. They stood listless in the paltry shade of the mesquite, their tongues lolling. The creek, which had been a reliable ribbon of silver, retreated into itself, becoming a series of stagnant, muddy pools, then a mere trickle that barely wet the stones. Work became a war against the sun. Every morning, Daniel and Tala rose before the dawn, while the air was still cool enough to breathe without pain. They hauled water from the deep well, the rusted crank groaning in protest as they filled troughs bucket by bucket. It was back-breaking labor, their arms burning, their shirts soaked with sweat within an hour of sunrise. But in the crucible of the heat, the distance between them evaporated. The awkwardness of the early days, the silence of jailer and prisoner, was replaced by the fluid, wordless rhythm of partners. They rode together now. Daniel had given her a sturdy, dun gelding, not as fast as his bay, but sure-footed in the rocks. They spent long days in the saddle, pushing the small herd higher into the foothills where the grass was still faintly green. Tala wore a pair of trousers Daniel had cut down for her and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed her face. From a distance, she looked like a slim boy. Up close, she was something else entirely, a creature of the land, moving with an efficiency that Daniel found himself watching more often than the cattle. They mended fences side by side, Daniel stretching the wire with the claw hammer, Tala nailing the staples home with quick, precise strikes. When he passed her the wire cutters, his fingers brushed against her palm. The touch was brief, electric, sending a jolt through him that had nothing to do with the static in the dry air. He would pull his hand back, catching her eyes for a split second, dark, unreadable, yet filled with a heat that mirrored his own. One afternoon, they stopped to water the horses at a seep in the rocks.